Have you ever walked into a room and felt like everyone there belonged, except you? Smarter, more confident, more successful, and even if no one said a word, something inside you whispered, "You don't belong here." Maybe you felt it in meetings, at social gatherings, on dates, or even scrolling through social media at night. That quiet, uncomfortable sensation that somehow everyone else figured life out, except you. So you start adjusting yourself. You speak less. You analyze every word before saying it. You try to appear confident while secretly hoping no one looks too closely. Because deep down, there's a hidden fear. A fear that if people truly saw who you are, they would realize something you've been afraid of your whole life. That maybe you're not enough. But what if I told you something that might change the way you see yourself forever? What if that feeling, that constant sense of being less than, is not proof of your limitations, but the result of a story your mind learned to believe? A story that started long before you even knew it existed. And once you see it, you can never unsee it. Here's the strange thing about feeling inferior. Most people who carry it don't talk about it. Because from the outside, their lives often look completely normal. They go to work, they laugh with friends, they post pictures online, they achieve things. And yet, beneath all of that, there's a quiet voice running in the background. A voice that constantly asks questions like, am I really good enough for this? What if people realize I don't actually belong here? How did everyone else become so confident? So life slowly turns into a silent comparison game. You walk into a room, and your brain immediately starts scanning. That person seems more intelligent. That one is more attractive. That one speaks with more certainty. And suddenly, without even noticing, your mind places you somewhere near the bottom of the list. Not because anyone ranked you there, but because you did. And over time, this invisible habit becomes exhausting. You overthink conversations after they happen. Did I sound stupid? Why did I say that? They probably think I'm incompetent. You replay small moments over and over in your mind like a broken film reel. And the most painful part? People around you may even see you as capable, talented, smart, hardworking. But no matter how much evidence appears in front of you, something inside refuses to believe it. Because when a certain story takes root in the mind, logic rarely wins against it. And this raises a deeper question most people never stop to ask. Where did this feeling actually begin? Because no one is born believing they are less than everyone else. Somewhere along the way, that belief was learned. And the moment you understand where it started, you begin to understand something even more powerful. Maybe this feeling was never truly yours to begin with. No one enters the world believing they are inferior. A child doesn't look at other children and think, they are more valuable than I am. Children begin life with something powerful, a natural sense of worth. But that sense of worth is fragile, because during childhood, the brain is constantly trying to answer one silent question: who am I? And the answers rarely come from inside. They come from the people around us. Sometimes it begins with small moments. A teacher who compares you to another student. Why can't you be more like your brother? A parent who only shows approval when you succeed. Or worse, a home where affection feels conditional. You learn very quickly what earns love. Good grades, good behavior, achievement. And slowly, without realizing it, the child begins to draw a dangerous conclusion. If I'm not impressive, maybe I'm not valuable. Other times, the story begins outside the home. Bullying at school, being laughed at for the way you look, the way you speak, or the way you think. Moments that adults might forget in a day can become permanent memories in a child's identity. Because the developing mind does something extraordinary. It turns experiences into beliefs. A few painful moments can quietly become a lifelong sentence. I'm not as good as other people. And once that sentence is written inside the mind, the brain begins searching for evidence to prove it true. Years later, you may not remember the exact moment it began, but the feeling remains. A quiet assumption that somehow everyone else received something you didn't. And from that moment forward, life becomes less about discovering who you are and more about trying to prove that you are enough. But here's the paradox. The more someone tries to prove their worth, the more they may unknowingly hide something deeper, because many people who appear confident on the outside are actually wearing something else entirely, a mask. And once you see this mask, you begin to notice it everywhere. Here's something most people never realize. Many of the most confident-looking people you know aren't actually confident at all. They're compensating. Because when someone secretly feels inferior inside, the mind often creates a strategy to protect itself, a mask. And the strange thing about this mask is that it can look like success. It can look like ambition. It can even look like confidence. Take perfectionism. From the outside, it looks like discipline, but internally, it often sounds like this. If everything I do is flawless, maybe no one will see my flaws. Or consider the person who works constantly, always achieving, always producing, always pushing harder than everyone else. People admire their drive, but inside, the motivation might not be passion, it might be fear. The fear that if they stop proving themselves, their value will disappear. Then there's the deep need for approval, the subtle habit of reading people's reactions, adjusting your personality depending on who you're with, trying to be impressive, likable, safe. Because somewhere deep inside, there's a belief quietly guiding everything. If people truly saw me, they might not choose me. So the mask becomes necessary. You smile when you feel insecure. You appear confident when you feel small. You overachieved to silence the voice that says you're not enough. And sometimes, the mask works so well, even the person wearing it forgets it's there. But there's one force in modern life that makes this struggle even more intense, a force that quietly feeds the feeling of inferiority every single day. And most of us interact with it for hours without realizing what it's doing to our minds. The human brain has a habit. It constantly measures, not in numbers, but in status. For thousands of years, this instinct helped humans survive. Our ancestors needed to understand where they stood in the group, who was stronger, who had influence, who had resources, because status meant safety. But in the modern world, that same instinct has found a new playground, your phone. Every time you open social media, your brain enters a silent arena of comparison. You see someone your age who already built a successful company, another person traveling the world, someone with a perfect relationship, a perfect body, a perfect life. And your brain does something incredibly unfair. It compares your behind-the-scenes reality to everyone else's highlight reel. Within seconds, a quiet conclusion begins forming. I'm falling behind. Even if your life is objectively good, even if you've accomplished meaningful things, the mind doesn't measure reality. It measures relative position, and the internet gives you access to millions of people who appear to be doing better, more attractive, more confident, more accomplished. So the brain does what it was designed to do. It searches for where you rank, and almost always, it finds someone above you. But here's the dangerous part. If someone already carries the hidden belief that they are not enough, social comparison becomes gasoline on the fire. Every scroll becomes subtle confirmation. See? Everyone else is ahead. And the more this happens, the more that old internal narrative grows stronger. But something fascinating happens when we look closer at this pattern, because the people who seem the most confident sometimes carry the exact same invisible struggle. Let me show you something through two stories that might feel uncomfortably familiar.
Let me tell you about Daniel. Daniel works at a large company. From the outside, he looks successful, respected, competent. In meetings, people often ask for his opinion. But every time he sits at that conference table, something strange happens inside his mind. While others are talking, Daniel isn't just listening, he's calculating. Did that sound intelligent? What if I say something obvious? They're probably realizing I'm not as capable as they think. So sometimes he stays quiet, not because he lacks ideas, but because he's afraid that if he speaks, someone might discover what he secretly fears is true, that he somehow slipped into a room where he doesn't belong. The tragedy of imposter syndrome is that capable people doubt themselves, while the unqualified rarely do. Now let me tell you about Maya. Maya is talented, creative, driven, passionate about her work. Her friends constantly tell her she should start her own business. But every time she gets close to trying, something inside stops her. A voice that sounds calm, logical, almost protective. You're not ready yet. Other people are more qualified. You need more experience. So she waits. Another year, another opportunity passes. Another version of her life quietly fades away. But here's what both Daniel and Maya don't realize. Their problem isn't intelligence, it isn't talent, and it isn't opportunity. Their real struggle is something far more invisible, a belief installed so early in life that it feels like a fact, but in reality, it's just a story. And once you understand this next idea, you might begin to see your own life very differently, because the truth about the inferiority complex is not what most people think, not even close.
Here's the truth most people never hear, and once you see it, you can't unsee it. An inferiority complex is not proof that you are inferior. It is proof that someone, somewhere, convinced you that you were. It means that at some point in your life, something convinced you that you were. That's a massive difference. Because the feeling of inferiority is not born from reality, it is born from interpretation. A child gets compared to a sibling. A teacher shows disappointment, classmates laugh, a parent withdraws affection, and the young mind, still trying to understand the world, makes a powerful conclusion. Something about me must not be enough. But here's what that child didn't know. Children don't have the emotional tools to question those moments. They don't say, maybe my teacher was having a bad day, or maybe my parents were dealing with their own pain. Instead, the brain does something much simpler. It turns the experience into identity. Not, that moment hurt, but I am the problem. And once that belief forms, the mind becomes incredibly loyal to it. Psychologists call this confirmation bias. The brain starts collecting evidence. A mistake at work? See, I'm incompetent. A rejection in dating? Of course they didn't choose me. Someone else succeeds? They're better than I am. But notice something strange. The mind ignores all the opposite evidence, your achievements, your growth, your resilience. Because the brain isn't trying to discover the truth, it's trying to protect a story it learned long ago. And that story becomes so familiar that it starts to feel like reality. But once you recognize that this belief is a story, something extraordinary begins to happen. You start noticing how deeply it has shaped your life, your choices, your relationships, even the opportunities you never allowed yourself to pursue. And that's where the real cost of this invisible belief begins to appear. When someone quietly believes they are not enough, it doesn't stay inside their thoughts. It begins shaping the way they move through life, the way they love, the way they work, the way they choose their future. Take relationships. People who carry an inferiority complex often enter love with an invisible fear. The most dangerous identity you can live with is the one you never chose. Not the fear of being alone, but the fear of being fully seen. So they may accept less than they deserve. They tolerate disrespect. They stay in relationships where they constantly feel small. Not because they want to suffer, but because a part of them quietly believes, this might be the best I can get. And sometimes the opposite happens. They avoid relationships entirely, not because they don't want connection, but because rejection would confirm their deepest fear. The same pattern appears in careers. A promotion opportunity appears, a new business idea emerges, a leadership role opens, and before they even try, the inner voice speaks first. You're not ready. Someone else is more qualified. What if you fail publicly? So they hesitate, and hesitation slowly becomes a life pattern. Years pass, opportunities pass, and from the outside, it may look like caution, but internally, it is something else. Self-protection. Because risking success can feel terrifying when part of you believes you don't deserve it. And over time, this belief does something even more powerful. It begins shaping your identity. Not who you truly are, but who you believe you are allowed to be. And that's where the inferiority complex becomes something much deeper. It becomes a prison, one with invisible walls that most people don't even realize they're living inside.
The most dangerous part of an inferiority complex is not the feeling itself, it's what that feeling eventually becomes, an identity. At first, it's just a quiet thought. Maybe I'm not as capable as others. But thoughts repeated long enough begin to shape beliefs, and beliefs slowly shape behavior. You hesitate more, you second-guess your instincts, you hold back your voice in conversations, you avoid situations where you might be judged. And little by little, something subtle happens. Your world begins to shrink. Not dramatically, not overnight, but quietly, like a room whose walls move inward 1 inch at a time. You stop applying for opportunities that once excited you. You silence ideas before sharing them. You convince yourself certain dreams are unrealistic, not because they actually are, but because somewhere deep inside, a rule has been written. People like me don't do those things. So instead of becoming who you could be, you become who you think you're allowed to be. And the tragedy is that most people never question this identity. They assume it's accurate. They assume it's honest. They assume it's who they truly are. But imagine something for a moment. What if the person you believe yourself to be was built on a misunderstanding? What if the limits you've accepted were never real to begin with? Because the inferiority complex has one final secret, and once you see it clearly, the prison walls start to crack. Not all at once, but enough to realize something extraordinary. You are never as small as the story made you believe. At some point, a quiet but powerful realization begins to emerge. The inferiority complex is not an identity. It's a wound that learned how to speak. For years, maybe decades, that voice in your mind has been narrating your life, interpreting events, predicting rejection, explaining why you shouldn't try. But what most people never stop to ask is a simple question: who taught this voice to speak? Because that voice didn't appear out of nowhere. It was shaped by criticism, by comparison, by painful moments that your younger self didn't know how to process. And over time, those moments formed a story that sounded like truth. I'm not smart enough, I'm not attractive enough, I'm not confident enough. But when you slow down and examine those sentences, something surprising appears. They're not facts, they're interpretations, and interpretations can be wrong. Think about this. A single moment of rejection can echo in someone's mind for 20 years. A careless comment from a parent or teacher can become a lifelong belief. But that moment was never meant to define your identity. It was simply a moment. Yet the mind turned it into a conclusion about who you are. And once you recognize this, the story begins to lose its authority. The voice that once sounded absolute starts to sound questionable. Because maybe your life was never limited by your potential. Maybe it was limited by a narrative that can be challenged, rewritten, and eventually replaced. But this raises a deeper question. If your value was never truly defined by criticism, comparison, or failure, then where does your value actually come from? To answer that, we have to look beyond psychology, into something deeper. Psychology can explain where the inferiority complex comes from: childhood experiences, social comparison, learned beliefs. But psychology alone cannot answer one deeper question: what determines your value as a human being? Because if your worth is defined by achievements, there will always be someone more successful. If your value is defined by appearance, there will always be someone more attractive. If your identity depends on other people's approval, then your sense of worth will always remain fragile. And this is where an ancient spiritual idea becomes incredibly powerful. The idea that your value was never meant to be earned. It was meant to be inherent. In the biblical perspective, human worth is not determined by performance. It begins with creation itself. In the book of Genesis, there is a simple but radical statement: human beings were created in the image of God. That idea changes everything. Because if your value comes from something sacred,
then criticism cannot remove it. Failure cannot erase it. Comparison cannot diminish it. Your worth was not assigned by classmates, not by social media, not by your past mistakes. It was given long before those voices ever appeared. And that means something incredibly important. The story that says you are less than others was never the original story. It was an interruption, a distortion, a misunderstanding of who you actually are. But when someone begins to see themselves through a different lens, something inside them begins to shift. The old narrative loses its grip. The quiet shame begins to loosen. And slowly, a new possibility appears. The possibility that your life was never meant to be lived from a place of proving your worth, but from a place of remembering it.
So maybe the story you've been telling yourself was never the truth. Maybe that quiet voice saying, "You're not enough," was never your voice to begin with. Maybe it was an echo of criticism you absorbed as a child, an echo of comparisons that slowly shaped how you saw yourself, an echo of moments that hurt more deeply than anyone realized. And over time, those echoes became so familiar, they started sounding like facts. But they were never facts. They were interpretations, and interpretations can change. Think about how many decisions in your life were influenced by that invisible story. The opportunities you didn't pursue, the words you didn't say, the dreams you quietly placed back on the shelf. Not because you lacked the ability, but because somewhere inside you believed you were not the kind of person who gets to live that life. But what if that belief was never accurate? What if you were never inferior, only convinced that you were? Because the most powerful prisons in the world are not made of walls, they're made of beliefs. And the moment you begin to question those beliefs, the door starts to open. Slowly, quietly, but unmistakably. You start speaking with more honesty. You start taking risks you once avoided. Maybe you were never broken. Maybe you were just a person who learned to see yourself through wounded eyes. Your value, not because you proved it, not because you earned it, but because it was always part of who you are. So if something in this video made you pause, if a part of you felt seen while watching this, then maybe this message was meant to find you today. And if you know someone who silently struggles with feeling not enough, share this video with them. Because sometimes one idea, one realization, can change the way a person sees themselves for the rest of their life. And if you want more content that explores the hidden psychology behind our emotions, identity, and purpose, make sure to subscribe to the channel. Because some of the most important discoveries we ever make are not about the world around us. They're about who we truly are.